This video is sponsored by AG1. This is a prison in Finland, but it doesn't look like any prison you've seen before.
I'm not in prison, I'm in, yeah, like you said, holiday camp.
Here, inmates are allowed to leave the prison on their own, go to a job or school, and then come back using their own keys. They wear their own clothes, go shopping, cook their own meals, and even order takeout. And there are no cell blocks, no sentry towers, and no walls. Only dorm rooms with a lot of light and nice furniture. And this prison is only one out of many, as almost half of Finnish prisons look very much like this one. And as the country is changing its prisons from deeply depressing places cut off from the rest of the world into comfortable re-education centers with a campus feeling. But what are the results? Is making prisons nicer and more humane resulting in crime getting better or worse? And if they work, then why aren't we doing the same thing everywhere? This is how Finland fixed prisons. But first, I want to talk to you about a sponsor of this video, AG1. AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that's designed to support your whole body health. Personally, I've always been the type of person that takes a lot of vitamins, and it can be quite complicated to figure out what you should be taking and to maintain the routine. And after using AG1 for the past couple months, I gotta say it makes it a lot easier. You drink it once a day, and it has all the nutrients you need to support your immune system, improve your stress and energy levels, and promote healthy aging. Personally, when I take it every day, I feel like my immunity gets significantly better. And even though that's a subjective experience, I feel like it helps me keep sort of a healthy routine even when I travel, which is quite a lot. It is a bit of an acquired taste. To be honest, in the first week I didn't really like it, but after drinking it daily for some time, I really got used to it, and now I would say it tastes pretty good. So if you want to try it out, go to drinkag1.com/explainedwithdom to get started on your first order. AG1 is going to give you a free 1-year supply of AG vitamin D3 plus K2 and 5 AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Thanks to AG1 for sponsoring, and now back to the video. In most of the world, prisons or correctional facilities have one major issue. Instead of actually correcting the behavior for which inmates ended up in there, they tend to reinforce it instead. Most people who are released from prison in almost any developed country end up back in there in less than 3 years, and only a tiny percentage manage to successfully reintegrate back into society. And so while prisons put the inmates out of sight for a while, they don't really solve anything in the long term, and they actually help sustain the prison population at ever higher numbers. But Finland and Nordic countries in general seem to defy this trend. That's because their prison systems are operating in a completely different way than in most of the world. So what are they doing differently? Finland has 2 types of prisons. Traditional, closed prisons, resembling more what you would find in other countries, and progressive, open prisons. But both types follow a model called restorative justice. The idea is pretty straightforward. Prisons should aim not just to punish people, but instead focus on turning inmates into functioning members of society after they are released. The basic premise is that if you treat people as monsters, you can expect them to behave that way. And if you treat them as people, they might respond a lot better. And so everything about how prisons operate is dedicated to this goal. It starts with the environment itself, that follows what's called a principle of normality. The idea that life in prison should resemble life outside as closely as possible. That's why in a number of prisons, inmates wear their own clothes. They have computers and cell phones, and they can cook their own meals in communal kitchens. The people who work with prisoners are also completely different. In most countries, prison guards are law enforcement officers who go through a few weeks of training that mostly teaches them how to use force to subdue prisoners. In Finland, the guards are seen more like social workers or counselors rather than just security, and they go through years of training focused on psychology and communication, and their goal is to create a relationship with the inmates and guide them to become better people than when they came in. And finally, there's a principle of reintegration, meaning that everything that happens is done to make sure that once you leave, you don't come back. That's why inmates are taught various traits and skills so that they are more employable, and why they get career counseling, therapy, and addiction treatment. and their release back to society happens gradually, and before it happens, inmates are moved to low-security prisons that aim to make the line between prison and the outside world as thin as possible in order to prepare them for normal life. These are called open prisons, and they house around 30% of Finland's prison population and play an incredibly important role. Because while these principles apply in all Finnish prisons, it's the open ones that take it way further. They don't have locks, gates, or fences, and prisoners are allowed to leave and come back on their own to go to work or school. The idea is that removing everything that we associate with prison, including physical barriers, will develop a sense of self-control. By not escaping, inmates are choosing to accept the rules and their sentence, something that doesn't happen in closed prisons because the choice is not there, but something that's key for being able to successfully return back to society after release. But while all of this sounds nice, how things should work in theory and how they work in reality are two different things. So what are the results? Well, let's compare the stats. In the US, for example, more than half of prisoners end up back in prison, and this metric is very similar in other Western countries. In Australia, for example, the rate of recidivism is basically the same. That means that prisons don't really fulfill one of their basic functions. They don't change your behavior for the better, and you are likely to continue with criminal activity after your sentence. And even if you manage to stay out of prison, the experience will most likely negatively impact you for the rest of your life, which is why former inmates are at a high risk of homelessness and addiction. Nordic countries in general, on the other hand, seem to have much better results. They have significantly less prisoners because prison sentences are usually seen as a last resort, and the rate of recidivism is a lot lower. In Finland, the rate is around 35%, and in Norway, which has a very similar system as Finland, it's at 20%, 3 times lower than the Western average and one of the lowest rates in the world. And data shows that the open prisons play a big role in that. In Finland, prisoners who serve their sentence in an open prison are 25% less likely to commit crimes after release, compared with those who have been in a standard closed prison. And then there are the economic aspects, because prisons are actually incredibly expensive. Providing accommodation, food, and 24/7 maximum security for hundreds of thousands of people costs a lot of money. And if almost all of those people end up either coming back or living on the street, it becomes a huge strain on your budget. On the other hand, even though open prisons can house less inmates and they require more effort and better trained staff, because of their effect on reducing recidivism, Finland actually spends less in the long run. Now, obviously, it's never gonna work every time. Some people just won't comply with the soft approach, and they will never change their behavior no matter what. And there will always be a need for more traditional prisons with high security that will actually stop the inmates from escaping. But still, the Finnish example shows that the way that prisons work could be better. And if it works, then why aren't we doing it everywhere? Well, first, there are some practical reasons. Finland has a very small prison population with 3 times less prisoners per capita than the global average, and 10 times less than the US, because they replaced a lot of short-term prison sentences with community service and fines. And the more prisoners you have, the harder it is to provide individual care to every one of them. In most of the world, prisons are overcrowded and overwhelmed, and they usually barely manage to just maintain a relatively safe environment. And there's simply not enough time to think about how it could be done better. But nevertheless, the real reason why this model doesn't exist anywhere else outside of Scandinavia is ideological rather than practical. And at the end of the day, it comes down to what do we actually have prisons for? In theory, prisons should serve both as a punishment for bad behavior and as places where people learn not to behave this way anymore. But in reality, in most of the world, the focus is almost exclusively on punishment. That's why, even though most people know that prisons are horrible places, they don't really have a problem with it. Because in our mind, prisons are bad places for bad people that deserve to experience the bad things. But if you lock someone up in a horrible place, you can't expect that their behavior will get better. And so fixing their wrong behavior almost never happens. In Scandinavia, it's the complete opposite. Losing your freedom is considered a sufficient punishment, and making it a horrible experience on top is seen as counterproductive. But even though the data shows that this approach seems to work, changing the idea of what prisons are for is incredibly difficult. The idea of open prisons and better treatment of inmates tends to be highly unpopular, and there is a strong public opinion that inmates should have it tough because they deserve it. And so it looks like the Scandinavian model of improving prisons will remain unique for a while.